If you've ever been interested in the chemistry or the logistics of dyeing a warp or painting a warp, then stay tuned. Hello there, my name is Trent and I'm the Weft. Welcome to my tiny fiber studio. It's June. It's time for Pride. I'm very excited to be dyeing something really beautiful for my loom. I have a set of scarves which I've sold on my website for some years now called the Aurora scarves. They're a dyed warp scarf. They have all the full spectrum of the rainbow, and I think they're absolutely beautiful. I haven't made one in several years. Oh, that thunder is really loud. I don't know if you could hear that. But I haven't made one in several years, and I'm really excited to dip my toes back into warp dyeing. And I thought I would bring you along for the process. You may remember in a vlog from last July, I made this warp a year ago, and I went through an entire move before I got around to dyeing it. And unfortunately, in that move, one of the threads in that warp got snagged and it broke. So I have some problems with that a little bit. I'm not too worried about it. It's just a plain weave project, so it doesn't matter if it's one thread less, but it was a little bit frustrating. It's time to get started, but first I want to let you know that you don't have to take notes. I've already done it for you. If you go to my website at the link in the description below, you'll see that you can download for free a project worksheet for this entire project, just to make it easy. It includes things like tips and tricks, recipes, resources, everything that you're going to need. Without further ado, let's get to the video.
So before you dye a rainbow warp, you need to go ahead and make a really good warp. And I'm using a horizontal warping mill for this. As you see, I have a guide string, which gives me the accurate length for how much I'm going to need in this warp to weave 3 scarves. And I'm going to be weaving this in rayon. This is 5/2 rayon. I'm going to be winding this warp in 4 threads. So I've got 4 cones of yarn. This is going to quadruple the speed of how long it takes to wind the warp, but also the warp will be threaded 1, 2, 3, 4 in a twill pattern. So it's actually very convenient to have the cross in the warp be a 4x4 cross. Now once I get to the requisite number of sections, what I'll do is I will stop and tie a counting tie. So you see I'm double checking my count here, and then roughly a yard-ish, a little less than a yard, I'm going to tie a counting tie. Now I'll show you a close-up in just a second of doing that counting tie, but essentially I do crochet chain around the different sections of yarn. It's also quite convenient to do a counting tie that is in 1-inch increments. That way when you're distributing your warp in the rattle, it can be very, very quick. I really love working with a horizontal warping mill. It's a lot better on my back, not having to go up and down with a vertical warping mill or go back and forth with a warping board, especially when I'm winding a long warp like this. Warping boards can get quite tedious. Now you'll notice I'm using a stitch counter on my finger to help count this warp. So every time I make a new section, a new length, I'll click my counter one time, and that keeps me pretty well on track. All right, so this is what I was talking about earlier when I chain around my counting threads. It's just that easy. Now when it's time to tie off my warp, I've wound all that I need to wind. I create some tie strings that are all the same length. These are a little longer than what I need. I find them to be a lot easier to work with instead of quite short. And I tie everywhere. So I tie at both ends of the warp. I tie my cross in 4 sections. And then I also tie every yard of the warp. And instead of using a tight choke tie like you would on a regular warp, because I'm dyeing this, I use a figure 8 tie. So here is the figure 8 tie. I actually do a, I guess, triple 8 as opposed to a standard figure 8 tie. But I keep this very loose so that it's easy to dye without the choke tie giving a resist. You'll notice when I tie this off, it's quite loose. One thing you'll note too is when I'm tying a warp that's going to be dyed, I don't use bows, I use knots, because this is going to go through a lot of agitation and motion. I want to make sure that I use a nice secure knot. I know it's a little scary to use scissors to remove ties, etc. from a warp, but it really is the only way, I think, when you're going to be agitating a warp as much as I am. So now I'm trimming off the ends of all the ties so that they won't get in the way, and I chain it off, ready for storing. I actually made this warp a year ago, and I'm just now dyeing it. Warp ready to be dyed into a solution of soda ash. This is 1.5 gallons of water and half a cup of soda ash dissolved. I don't find that with this particular rayon thread I need to scour. It's a pretty clean thread. But if you'll see the sheet you can download from my website, I'll talk about scouring other cellulose fibers. I weigh it down and let it sit. While that is soaking in the soda ash water, I lay out my saran wrap for wrapping my warp. It is kind of a breezy day, and I'm having a miserable time keeping this saran wrap in place. So, since I have my new stainless steel table, I decided to use magnets to help hold it down. If you were on a different type of table, you may need to use tape or something like that. Or if you're doing this inside, just be sure that you're doing it in an area that you don't mind getting messy. After 30 minutes of soaking, I take out the warp. I'm going to squeeze out as much of the soda ash water as I can, but I am going to rely on my spin dryer to get out the majority of this. I can't recommend a spin dryer enough. It makes this process not only easy, it makes it possible as far as I'm concerned. Now, doing short warps, it's pretty easy to do on your own without the spin dryer, but if you're doing a long warp like this, you really need the spin dryer. What I enjoy about the spin dryer is it gets my yarn very, very dry, but still has liquid soda ash water in it so that the chemical reaction with the dye happens properly, but it's not sopping wet with a ton of extra liquid. And the good thing about the spin dryer is you can put a pot under it to drain, and then when you're finished draining your yarn, you can add that back into the soda ash water that you had previously and keep reusing it and reusing it. You'll notice I spin it until there's just a little trickle left. It won't stop completely for a while, so I just take it out when the dripping is relatively slow. Now I will carefully take the warp out. And I will arrange it on my arm and then lay it out on the table. So I find it really important to lay it out on the plastic that we're going to be wrapping it in. And your overlaps and twistbacks will be as long as the surface you have to make. So for instance, this is a 6-foot table, so all of my repeats will be in 6-foot increments. So I'm going to lay out all of the warp side by side. One of the things that you'll notice when you are dyeing warps is that the sections that fold back, the pattern will reverse itself. I find this really, really interesting. If this is an issue for you, you may want to find some way of making a spiral with your warp so that you can do a continuous pattern with no repeats. But I have sold many of these scarves and no one has ever complained about a reversal and a repeat. There's so many colors you would never notice. One thing that I think is important so that I'm not wasting dye is condensing your warp down. So I don't pack it so tight that it's overlapping, but I do condense it down so that the colors can easily bleed between one area of the chain and the other. Now that everything is arranged appropriately, it's time to start the dye process. And that's my favorite because I use a live mixing technique. I'm only going to use 3 colors of dye. And as you'll see in the next sequence, they make all the colors of the rainbow. So as far as mixing the dyes, all that information is in the project sheet, which you can download for free from my website. But essentially, it's 4 cups of water, 30 grams of urea, and 30 grams of each color of the dye. We're starting with the fuchsia red. The fuchsia red tends to be the thickest of the dyes, so it doesn't spread quite as evenly. And as you'll see later, I'll do some manipulation to overcome that downside. I also tend to squirt the dye on in a zigzag going with the direction of the warp so that it emphasizes the ikat kind of effect. I think the next color I'm choosing, is the yellow. The yellow flows the easiest, and you're going to see that where the yellow and the fuchsia red overlap, you get a red-orange color. So remember, each section of color you're putting down, you actually need to put down a width that's 3 times that color. So if I'm going for yellow, I need to make sure that a third of it becomes orange and a third of it becomes green. And I find that the yellow out of all the colors tends to be the one that other colors bleed into the most because it's the most fluid. And so I tend to leave a slightly wider section of yellow than I do other colors, just to make sure that in the end product I have a lot of yellow, or at least the appropriate amount. Now you'll notice when I add the blue, you're going to get a beautiful green. This is what I'm talking about live mixing, as opposed to mixing separate colors. I let the colors mix on the yarn, and I think this just gives a really beautiful effect that you can't really get from pre-mixing your colors. It also saves a lot of time and effort. I only need 3 bottles as opposed to 6. All right, and now we repeat back to the fuchsia red, and you'll see I'll overlap that on the blue, and that'll make a very deep, moody, beautiful purple. Let's speed this process up a little bit. It's pretty much a repeat at this point. Now you'll see what I was talking about. The fuchsia red doesn't flow quite as easily, and you'll see that there's still some pink-white areas underneath. So I massage the color into the yarn. I do this with my gloved hand as to not stain my hands, but also I can, between colors, either change gloves or go rinse my hands. Double checking, as I said, this for some reason this red color is the one that's guilty the most of not transferring easily between the entire line of warp. And while I have my red on my hands, I go to my other sections of red. That way I don't have to keep washing my hands repeatedly. This is why you need a sturdy surface to work on, because I'm pressing quite firmly into the yarn. We'll speed this up a little bit. The process is pretty much the same for all the colors. Yellow and blue need a lot less pressing than the other colors though. So you notice I just washed my hands. And it's time to wrap up the yarn. It's important to keep the yarn moist so that the chemical reaction between the soda ash, the fiber, and the fiber reactive dye works properly. So I like to seal it up in a plastic wrap. I suppose if you had some sort of really large covered lid or something, you could use that. But this is, I think, the easiest method is to keep it wrapped up. The cling film or saran wrap works pretty well at this. I have used the wide wrap that they use for wrapping things during moving, and also the carpet protector film. They both work well too. At this point, we're going to roll up the yarn, and we have two options. One is to let the yarn batch by just sitting out for 6 to 24 hours. I really find no difference between the 6 to 24. The other option is to steam, and this is when I used to have access to an industrial steamer. I would steam the yarn for 30 minutes. All right, after the batching process, this has been about 6 hours, it's time to get the yarn rinsed. And believe it or not, the first step I do is to spin it out with that same spin dryer. At this point, the fiber has reacted with the dye, and there'll be very little transfer from one color to another, so there's no risk in letting it touch the different sections. Once I get it into the dryer, it can be a little difficult to get a balanced load when you're plopping it in like I am. And I don't want to handle it too much because there's the risk of splashing. But if you find that it's really too unbalanced and it doesn't get better as you keep spinning, then you need to stop it and make an adjustment, which is what I'm doing right here. I'm going to spread it out as much as possible in a circle, and this is still going to be a little bit unbalanced, but once it comes up to full speed, it works just fine. Now you'll see the amount of color that's coming out. It's kind of a mix of all the colors, but the blue and the yellow, because they flow easier, tend to be the predominant color, so the tends to come out like a dark green. I'm going to keep on spinning. Once it gets up to speed, I can let go of it, and it will continue to spin just fine on its own. Once again, I'm looking for when there's barely a trickle. I do not have access to a paint sink or a utility sink anymore, so I'm going to be rinsing my yarn using a container of water, which is not my favorite way because it agitates the yarn a lot and it does get a little bit tangled up because of a broken thread that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to put our yarn into our rinse water. This is a long warp and it's very easy to get tangled if you agitate it too much. And you'll see that it does in fact get tangled. I know I've mentioned it a few times, but between making this warp a year ago and dyeing it, there was a move that happened, and one of the warp ends got broken during that move, and that ends up tangling the yarn pretty badly at one point. But absolutely do not panic because you can rescue it. So once again, you'll see that kind of greenish color come out of the yarn. We want to get rid of as much of it as we can, but honestly, as a weaver, I know I'm going to be weaving this myself. Getting out most of it is satisfactory because it's a lot easier to wash yarn once it's woven. And so after I get this scarf woven, I'll run it through the washing machine on high, and all of the rest of the dye will come out. So you'll see here some of the threads get a little bit tangled, but once again, I don't panic. I move slowly. I am squeezing out a significant portion of water because I'm going to spin dry this again. Do not try to detangle when the yarn is soaking wet. It will make a mess, and the yarn is more weak the wetter it is. At least that's true of rayon and to some extent cotton. Hemp and linen actually are a little bit stronger when they're wet. So I don't show the process of spin drying this before detangling, but trust me that I did it. And then here is the detangling process. I'm going to slowly work through my yarn, and I'm going to put my hand wherever the choke ties are, those figure 8 ties, and I'm going to snap the yarn. You see an area that is particularly messed up. Once again, it's because there was a loose thread that had gotten broken, and it tangled around other yarns. So I slowly shake it out, observe what's going on. I take my time. The rules are don't panic and don't reach for a pair of scissors. It's never helpful. In reality, this maybe took me 3 or 4 minutes to detangle. It wasn't bad at all. The shaking really helps. I left this whole sequence in because I wanted you to see that mistakes do happen, but they are fixable. You see that loose thread now that's causing the issues. So once again, grabbing at the choke ties and snapping the yarn. Once the yarn is totally dry and we're putting it on the loom, it'll be an ideal time to finally make sure that everything is in its place. Now it's time to dry the yarn. This is at my old house in Louisiana. Love drying it on the clothesline. Here at my new house, I just hang it on the banister. If you have a light colored banister or light wood, I would recommend putting a piece of plastic down first, as there can be residual dye. When you are beaming this warp, I recommend that you hold it in two sections if you want horizontal stripes, or hold it in one section if you want this kind of bargello zigzaggy arch like you see right here. I absolutely love this kind of shape stripe. When weaving, I recommend a dark yarn. As you see with this other colorway, I'm weaving with a dark blue, like a navy yarn. With my particular scarves, I always weave with black yarn on the rainbow warp, and that gives me the best effect. It's so beautiful, and I love making them.
There you have it. I absolutely love dyeing these warps and I absolutely love weaving them. Every time I advance the warp, a new set of colors comes toward me, and it's just so exciting and so thrilling. And you don't have to dye a 13 or 14 yard warp like I did. I like to, when I'm doing this, weave at least 3 scarves at once. And I weave them quite long because I wash them on hot, as I mentioned earlier. But you can weave them much shorter. You can dye a 4 yard warp. It's certainly a lot easier, and you probably don't need the spin dryer if you're doing that. I'm excited to see if you try this or try any other colors. I really recommend you trying some of the live mixing I was talking about. I think it looks absolutely beautiful on warps. Other than that, I want you to have a wonderful month. I want you to think about Tour de Fleece, which is coming up, and I want you to keep on crafting. Once again, I'm the Weft Right. Have a great day.